Hey YouTube, it's Pastor Dwayne here. So today we're going to be taking a look at the mark of the beast. Relatively recently, a number of prominent scholars had come out in the last few years and suggested that maybe we've got it all wrong. And we're not looking for 666 as the mark of the beast, but we're actually looking for 616 as the mark of the beast. Now, I'm a premillennial futurist dispensationalist guy. So for someone like me, knowing what the mark of the beast is relatively important. Am I looking for 666 or am I looking for 616? And I'm sure most of our premillennial dispensational friends would also concur with me. Now, there's a rather interesting side note here, and I just want to say this. A number of scholars will say things like, the variants are really small, they don't matter, and, none of the fundamentals of the Christian faith are affected. And to some extent, that's true, right? Regardless of whether you're picking up a critical text or whether you're picking up a Textus Receptus or Byzantine text, they will, however, agree with 94% of everything that's in there. But you know what? There are some variants that are a little bit more impactful than others. All right, so let's start reading the passage. So I've got the New King James Version up here. Again, it's one of my favorite translations. I'll point you to my video, leave it in the description or whatever it is. But anyway, the passage we're looking at is Revelation chapter 13, verse 18. Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. His number is 666. Now, it's really interesting. If you come over here with me, we're going to take a look at the Christian Standard Bible. It has the same passage. It says, this calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, because it is the number of a person. Its number is 666. And then it has a footnote here. The little C, I click on it, and it says, other Greek manuscripts read 616. Now, I want you to keep that in mind. It says, other Greek manuscripts read 616. Now, I'll just tell you right now what it means by other Greek manuscripts. It's literally two. There's two manuscripts that we know of today that read 666. There might have been four, a couple later minuscules, but there's a bit of a debate surrounding whether or not Tischendorf had an error when he recorded that. Again, I didn't spend too much time looking into that. Their late nature just didn't seem very important to me at the time, but there was a significant amount of other stuff to go into with this one, and you'll agree it's rather interesting. Now, this variant, it's been kind of known for some time. It didn't really take anyone surprised that there's a variant between 666 and 616. And for the most part, it had been thought of as just kind of like one of those things that are out there, but we know that 666 has been established for some time, and we know that that's the passage. But what happened is about 2011, I think maybe my date's a little bit wrong there, the findings of Papyrus 115 were published. And when they published it, they discovered, and take a look here with me, is that it contained the reading 616. 616. So I have the manuscript up in front of me. This is P115. It's categorized as a 3rd to 4th century manuscript, and you can see on the side here, it's a manuscript, a couple pages that are fragmented, very, very fragmented. And I have singled in on the passage that we're talking about today. Now, I can't zoom that in any further. Maybe I can do something post-processing. We'll do that. But you can see the reading right here. He, iota, and stigma. Yes, that's a stigma. That's not a sigma. There's actually a discussion surrounding writing sigma versus stigma on here, but I'm not really too concerned with that. But this is clearly 616. And then the other manuscript is... So let's go to Codex Ephraime Rescriptus. Let me just pull that up here. This is Codex 4. We'll put 04 in there. Now, I'm just going to show you the manuscript because I searched and I didn't want to spend too much time on it. I couldn't find it, but you'll understand why I couldn't find it just by looking at it. So the manuscript here, I'll zoom right in. It's a palimpsest. So the original text was scraped away. You see that underneath, and that's the biblical text. And then over top written here is I forget what it is that's written, but this is a 5th century manuscript. And this actually has 616, but it doesn't just have 616, it has it written out. 616 in Greek, hexadex, something like that. I should probably pull that up, but that's okay. Anyway, but these two manuscripts are really the only two manuscripts that we have which contain the mark of the beast as 616. So I know there's some discussion around two other minuscules. They are currently not extant. We don't have them. We've only heard of them through writings. In fact, I think Tischendorf is where we've heard about them from, and some have suggested that it's possibly a mistake on his part. Either way, we don't have those. So when it says when the CSB says according to other Greek manuscripts, the other Greek manuscripts is really only referring to these two Greek manuscripts here, to Papyrus 115, and this one here, Codex Ephraime Rescriptus. Now, I wanted to take a quick look at P115 because it's rather interesting. If we pull up our biblical text again, I want you to keep in mind here what we have going on, right? It says its number is 666. Its number is 666. The reason why this is important is because if we take a look at P115, you'll notice that right before we have 616 written there, we have the letter eta. Okay, and that's the word eta, and very likely in this scenario, it actually means or. So this passage doesn't seem to read, the mark of the beast is 616. Rather, what it means, the mark of the beast or 616. Anyway, the initial deciphering of this passage said that this is likely going to have in this lacunis area here, 666 or 616. I know some have debated whether or not that's possible, and it's rather interesting too here. There's a little line above the eta, and some have suggested that maybe that line indicates that this is an error and it should be taken out. However, I've taken a look at some of the other fragments here, and I don't see any such line like that to suggest that maybe this is the case. Again, I don't have a reasonable explanation for that little line either. But nonetheless, if that is true, right, or 616, it's very likely that 666 is written before it, and the scribe who wrote it wrote down 666 and recognized that there was also the reading 616 out there, and so he took the two readings and mashed them together, just like we have here. So this manuscript, Papyrus 115, is not necessarily a witness to the reading of 616, although it does say it exists. It does seem to witness that both 666 and 616 were running around at the same time. Papyrus 115, I don't believe, is as strong of a witness as initially thought. Nonetheless, let's look at some other things here. Could 666 fit? Absolutely, I believe it could. If you can zoom in there, you can see that there's a little bit of ink here, just a tiny little bit of ink. If that was a bottom right corner of a capital C, which would be required to be 666, there would be plenty of room beside it to have the stigma, and then on the other side of it to have the key. So I think that's rather convincing. Again, I still don't know necessarily about that little line, but there doesn't seem to be very much suggesting that that's indicating a mistake. Perhaps it could be indicating a conjecture on the scribe by adding or 616. So next we move on. So with all out of the way, those two Greek manuscripts, one that's kind of supports both and one that just supports the one, we move on to the early church fathers. We have to talk about Irenaeus. Okay, Irenaeus, he was somewhere around 180 AD. He wrote against heresies. And there's a passage in here against heresies 5.30.1. Reads this: I do not know how it is that some have erred following the ordinary mode of speech and have vitiated the middle number in the name, deducting the amount of 50 from it, so that instead of 6 decads, they will have it that there is but one. I am inclined to think that this occurred through the fault of the copyists, as is wont to happen, since the numbers also are expressed by letters, so that the Greek letter, which expresses the number 60, was easily expanded into the letter iota of the Greeks. What he's saying here is just simply like, yeah, I know that 616 is out there, but I don't know why people are doing this. This is an error. And Irenaeus, he knows better, right? Irenaeus, he's got all of the copies and he knows which ones are right. And so he's saying here that, yes, at 180 AD, I know of the 616 reading, but it's wrong. It's wrong. Now, apparently, some people in the early centuries were also taking the mark of the beast and trying to attribute it to people, right? And that's what we see all the time today, right? Every time there's a transition of power from someone, whether it's a new president or a new pope or King Charles, right? There is an effort made by Christians around the world to try and peg this individual as the Antichrist. It's true, that happens. And it was no different in Irenaeus' day. And you know what Irenaeus' thought was toward that? He said, guys, I can think of like 7 or 8 different names right now that match the mark of the beast. And I don't really even know if they are, and you don't even really know. And you shouldn't be so dogmatic, because if you're so dogmatic, you're going to be like the false prophets. That's what Irenaeus is saying here. So his advice, like his successor Hippolytus, was to simply let the prophecy get fulfilled, and you will recognize it when you see it. And I think that's pretty good advice today. But nonetheless, how does this help our case to know whether it's 616 or 666? So you take some of the other early church fathers, right? There was Irenaeus, who we just discovered had 666. You've got Hippolytus, who was kind of a disciple of Irenaeus. He is on the board of 666. You go to other people like Jerome, 666, made it into the Vulgate. Even Origen thought it was 666. So there's unanimous agreement among the early church fathers that the mark of the beast is not 616, but 666. And this is all before the 4th century. So it's on solid footing. It's on absolutely solid footing. Now, the only case of someone that I've found who really thought the 616 was a good number was a gentleman by the name of Tychonius, and he hailed around the 4th century and came up with a commentary on the book of Revelation. And his commentaries don't exist today. We don't have any extant copies, but what we do have are people who quoted his commentary in their own commentaries on Revelation. So Augustine, right? Another church father, really liked the work of Tychonius, but Augustine was also a witness to 666. Now, Tychonius was actually a Donatist. I didn't know what a Donatist was either, so I went and looked it up, and apparently it was a sect in northern Africa that kind of broke away from the main church at the time, and during the reign of Emperor Domitian, he brought down severe persecution on the church in North Africa, and he had given an ultimatum to a number of Christians to either give up their writings, to give up their Bibles, their manuscripts, their papyrus, whatever, or die. And so a number of them did end up giving up their manuscripts and papyrus. And so once the persecution settled and Domitian died and the next ruler came in and there was peace in the land, a group of men just said, hey, these guys who gave up the manuscripts, like, they're traitors. We don't want anything to do with them, and they shouldn't be allowed to minister. In fact, if you're going to be a minister, you need to be perfect in your conduct. And obviously, a number of people decried that and said, no, you can't do that. It's heresy. And they were kind of pushed off into their own little sect, and they became the sect of the Donatists. Now, it's interesting because this sect ended up taking that mark of the beast number, 616, and they sort of ran with it, and there was an interesting interpretation of the mark of the beast, 616. Now, Tychonius, he took an allegorical approach to the book of Revelation, and so when he came on 616, there's something really interesting about it. If we come back to that passage here, you will see that it looks like nomina sacra for Jesus. It looks like nomina sacra for Jesus. And Tychonius recognized that. And so his interpretation was that this symbol somehow represents Christ. Now, I didn't go into the whole nitty-gritty details of how he coincides that with the rest of the Revelation. But this interpretation actually made its way down through the Donatists, and it became a distinctive way that Donatists interpreted this passage. Now, if you go a little bit into the future, about the 750s or 800s, you start seeing discussion of this type of thing happening in a couple other commentaries, the Beatus commentaries, and there were a couple other anonymous commentaries, again, dated around 750, 800, that took this interpretation. And you can see that they had been influenced by Tychonius. So there had been a couple commentaries later with the 616 number in it, but it has always made its way back to Tychonius. So if we were really to consider which reading should we have, it's really hard to ignore the testimony of Irenaeus. In fact, it almost looks like the alternate reading surfaced somewhere in North Africa. Irenaeus got a hold of it, saw it, disagreed with it, wrote about it, and said, no, we're not going to be doing this one. And that seems to have stemmed the rest of the church to use the 616 reading. Some may argue, well, some of the early church fathers like Hippolytus, he was a disciple of Irenaeus, and he was just following Irenaeus because Irenaeus is his teacher. And to that I say that's great, but then you got to consider who Irenaeus' teacher was Polycarp. And who was Polycarp's teacher? It was John the Apostle, who wrote the book of Revelation. So if you take that a step further back, you find out that 666 has a lot more weight to it than 616. So where else could 616 have come from? Like I said, it seemed to have originated somewhere somewhere around North Africa. By the looks of the evidence and everything we see, we don't see anything out in the East or anything like that. So where did 616 come from? Obviously, based on the evidence and what we see amongst the two manuscripts being Egyptian manuscripts, right? Papyrus and Ephraime Rescriptus. These two manuscripts which have providence in Egypt, right? Again, that kind of North African region. And then you have Irenaeus talking about it in North Africa in 180, and the Donatists who took that and ran with it from North Africa. You're starting to get a hint here. It seems to have come from somewhere in North Africa. Now, it is possible that the Xi could have been mistaken for a iota. I know that's the argument that Irenaeus made. It does seem a bit of a stretch because Xi is very much different than iota, but I do want to point this out. So in the Latin translation, I'm wondering if this maybe came from an old Latin translation, but 666 in the Vulgate, I believe, is DCL XVI. Let's see. Calculate. I got it. That's 666. But if you were to be a scribe and you're copying it down and you miss a letter, say you forget to put the L in, you run the calculation here and look, it's 616. So this could have very easily been the slip of a scribe copying a Latin manuscript. And of course, once that got into the manuscript, I'm sure there'd be some people who took it and run with it. And it appears the Donatists did. But nonetheless, all this to say this, let's just do this tally together. All the Greek manuscripts that we have of Revelation, of pretty much all the Latin manuscripts. I think there's a reference to maybe one Armenian manuscript that had 616. I'll have to look a little further. I couldn't find it. But of all the manuscripts, of all the Greek manuscripts that we have, there's only two which witness to the 616 reading. And the one manuscript, Papyrus 115, doesn't just witness to the 616 reading, but also has a likelihood of witnessing to both the 666 and the 616 reading. So you're really down to maybe one and maybe 1.5 manuscripts that witness to the potential superiority of the 616 reading. When you flip over to the church fathers, you find almost unanimous consensus among the early church fathers that 666 is the mark of the beast, with the exception of Tychonius, who was associated with this Donatist group, whose commentary on Revelation contained 616, which influenced a few other commentaries. And it's interesting to note that though his interpretation of those passages were the same, those who used his work still didn't go with the 616 reading. So I know those are much later, but it seems that every instance of 616 that we have that's much later comes back to Tychonius. It really appears as though the 616 reading originated somewhere in North Africa and was promulgated from there. So now the claims that we might potentially have to burn tons of literature because of this variant, I say this, if you really feel the need to burn a bunch of literature, go and find those left behind books. There's plenty of them around, and that should curb the urge to burn anything else, and we don't need to do anything with the mark of the beast. Anyway, brothers and sisters, I hope you found this video helpful, and until next time, we'll see you around.